guys, this is Tatum
and Sydney,
and welcome to another episode of The Welcome Table. Today we are joined by Alonso Nichols. Alonso received a master's in Spanish from UCI and subsequently went to work as a Spanish instructor at the LA Times, and after that, he embarked on a full-time photography career as the chief of photography at Tufts University. How are you today, Alonso?
I'm doing well. It's great to be with you all. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm honored that you would ask me to be here.
Of course, we're honored to have you here.
Very, very honored. But first, we're going to do our usual show and tell, and I'm going to go this week. So I have right here one of my childhood favorite little short stories. It's called The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. And surface level, it's just a book about, a bunny, like a stuffed animal bunny. And he goes on this, he embarks on this journey. And, when I was a kid, I used to have my mom read it to me all the time. I just used to love this small little graphics in here.
I'm just seeing, bop after bop.
Oh, yeah. There we go.
So it has small images in here, and I just used to love looking at the pictures. But, into adulthood, upon rereading it, it's actually a really, really touching story about, life and journeys. And it has very, very deep messages as well. So everyone read The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. And this is also one of the books that sparked my interest in reading just in general. So, yeah, it's really important to me.
Awesome. Nice.
And then
Love
what
it.
Bring for us today?
So I had such a hard time figuring out what I wanted to bring, and then I decided to bring something that is a little bit in tune with what we might talk about today. So I brought a camera of all things, and this particular camera is one that I bought when I was traveling. So you all had asked me about travel. And most of my cameras are larger than this. And I was in the Philippines for 6 months back in 2015. And I decided to buy this small Fuji X100T camera, which really allowed me to kind of get out in the street and make pictures in a way that was really quiet. And it's something that I really just love. It's I can, it's small enough, this lens comes off. And it's small enough for me to just even stick in my pocket. It's really light, and I just love carrying a camera around and making pictures.
Yeah, awesome.
That's
Good for travel, right?
Yeah. Very light, very on the go. Yeah, and that brings us to our first question. Actually, we're both fans of travel. We just got back from a little mini vacay, COVID friendly in Joshua Tree.
Yes, it was very fun.
It was so much fun, and obviously you have traveled all over the world. So our first question is, what location has been your favorite place to photograph?
Wow. Gosh, that's a hard one. First of all, I love traveling. And I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, which is, and I grew up in a small part of a relatively small town. So I always wanted to get out and see the world. It was just so I had pen pals when I was 11 or 12 years old. And my pen pals were in Japan, South Korea, Spain, Philippines, and I've been to most of those countries now. I've really loved photographing and traveling in Latin America. I've been to Nicaragua three times since the 1990s, and it's one of my favorite places to make pictures. I love traveling around Asia. There's just so much happening in Asia, and Asia is so different. The Philippines is different from Japan, is different from Singapore. And so I think just to see how different life can be, it can be really stimulating.
Right. Nice. Right, exactly. And, in your career, most people don't typically receive degrees in what they actually end up pursuing. So with you received your master's in Spanish. So how did that end up happening? You're now the chief of photography at Tufts. So yeah, how did that end up happening? Tell us a little bit about your journey.
I always say, if you're an engineer, there's a very direct line that you can follow, right? There are very clear answers to becoming a mechanical engineer. And for me, it was growing up, there wasn't a really good arts curriculum where I was growing up, but I was very interested in pictures. My family sort of had the idea that a career making pictures probably wasn't going to make me any money, so I should really be like a doctor or a lawyer. And I got onto the idea of becoming a Spanish professor at one point because I love languages and I love literature and I love the ideas. And I think for me, like that's where the humanities was really important, because what studying humanities allowed me to do was sort of develop ideas and make connections. And so when I started studying Spanish literature at UCI, I really loved it. I mean, it was a world that I was able to be in, like a world of language, a world of ideas. It was a community of people who all were very passionate about those things. And when I went and worked at the LA Times, all of a sudden I had almost like an internship that was a front row seat to what could I do with this language and this cultural experience and this teaching experience that might open up another door. And so I started working with their reporters, I started working with their photographers, and I sometimes even went out on assignment with them. And I started realizing this is what I want to do. And so my experience at UCI turned my time at the LA Times into almost like a transitional place. It was like, this is where the ideas that I've been working on and developing might suddenly become realized. And it put me off on a whole other track. And so, you know, learning about photography from those photographers, seeing how they spent their time, and it really gave me some strong ideas about what I wanted to do with my time. And so that was the point of departure where I said, okay, I'm going to go try to work as a photographer and learn more photography. And my life really has been different for both of those experiences, language, literature, and then working in that world of journalism and photography with those folks.
Right. We wanted to ask, what was your experience as a person of color, both in the realm of academia and also professionally? Did you have any significant challenges that you faced?
You know, it's really interesting. And I think, so thinking back academically, you know, once I decided that I really wanted to study Spanish language and literature, on the one hand, like that department is its own cultural space. And so that was kind of amazing to have an alternative cultural space, you know, as a person of color, where everything is shifted in a way. So on the one hand, like we're still referencing ideas of Western culture in Spanish language, but we're also addressing the ways that Latin America, for example, has been transformed by colonialism. We're addressing indigenous ideas that remain in that culture and that literature, but also African ideas and elements of culture that have migrated to the Americas. And so to have those things form in a different way was really wonderful for me and very freeing. I think in terms of like professionally, I think a lot of the challenges that I've faced are similar to challenges that Black professionals or professionals of color face. You know, I think that you always are trying to understand what is the context of the workplace and who am I working with. We are dealing with structures of structural inequality. I live in Boston, where I think there's a lot less structural racism than there was where I grew up in Louisville. And on the other hand, it exists. And so I think working with systems so that they are more accountable is a challenge. I think trying to be heard can sometimes be a challenge. And I think as a man of color, it's like there are times when I say, if I'm being assertive, does that mean to someone that I'm being aggressive?
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, how do I manage my own feelings and resolve conflicts without being misinterpreted? Mm-hmm. Because there are things that I can't get away with, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think developing, but I think this is also where, again, working in the humanities has really been an advantage, because it's forced me to develop communication skills and interpersonal skills, studying language. Writing has been a critical tool for me to express my ideas And so I think all those things that I learned about people and human beings has been very important in how I navigate the professional world.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And on the subject of challenges, have you heard of the concept of Tokenism? Is this something that you've experienced in the workplace personally, something that you could speak on?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, right now, I think the whole world is in a place of self-evaluation. We're in a time when we're actually talking about structural racism again. And so the institution where I work, Tufts University, has a renewed commitment to dismantling structural racism, which is amazing. And we as professionals of color have had to have conversations with our institution about the fact that we do not necessarily want to be representatives who are tokens in that process. And we don't want to own a disproportionate amount of that work, because in some ways, this is not our work to do. We do our work in our own advocacy for one another. We do our work by showing up every day, but we don't own the structure. We can't transform the structure. That is for the people who are in power to do, and they have to learn. And to expect me to become a teacher within that framework is actually adding work onto my plate that I'm not compensated for. Mm-hmm. And so I think the one good thing about this time frame is we've actually been able to start having that conversation, mm-hmm. which for a long time was in some ways the hardest conversation to have, because I think for so long it was like, I'm just grateful to have this opportunity. And part of the incentive to have that opportunity was in some ways to be a token or to participate in being your representative. So you could say, yes, we hired a person of color, we've ticked off our box. Like, for so long, that was the framework. And I feel like now we're actually beginning to say, no, there are reasons why I'm here. I'm valuable to you. And I want you to actually start doing the work that you need to do so I can actually do my job.
Right. Yeah, it's not your job to teach people about, why systems are efficient or bad. That's mm-hmm. why Google exists. Mm-hmm. Right? Why Google.
I love that. Yes, right. That is why Google exists. Yes,
exactly. And speaking to your talents and a lot of the your academic background, we were wondering, how does being bilingual inform your work as a photographer and as the chief of photography at Tufts? And also, we wanted to know, what was it like to be a Spanish instructor at the LA Times? How was that experience? Was it fruitful in any way? Were there like drawbacks to being bilingual in any way? We just want to the general scope of what it was like.
So let me say up front, there's not one single drawback I can imagine to being bilingual.
Right.
And I always tell people, I think fundamentally, learning Spanish changed my life in ways that I could never have understood. First of all, it's like opened the door for me to communicate with millions of people around the world. It's actually unified the Americas for me, in the sense that I can travel to anywhere up and down the continent, and because of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, I also learned Portuguese. So, I can travel so many places in the Americas and actually connect with people. And as a photographer, in some ways, that's actually the most important part of what I do. I actually have to be able to connect and talk with people and understand not just what they're saying, but what it means. And I have to understand enough of the context around, like, how does the world work? How do people work? To understand what I'm stepping into or operating in. And I think that's been a really critical aspect of how I've worked as a photographer. And that's what studying literature is about. You're understanding ideas, you're understanding context and making meaning. And so, a lot of times it's like I'm traveling someplace, and it could be something as simple as, like, I need to get my equipment through customs. And so it's like I kind of need to be able to talk with people, and most customs officials do speak English, but sometimes they don't. But I think culturally understanding how to engage people is really critical. And then like once I'm off doing my work, it's like sometimes I find myself in people's homes. And sometimes that's here in the States. One of the pictures that you all had picked out is from one of my assignments where I photographed an incoming student to Tufts, Mateo Galeano. And, you know, it's like I ended up traveling down to New York to photograph Mateo and his family, and ended up sleeping on their floor overnight. And Mateo's family is from Colombia. And so speaking Spanish became a really critical bridge to me being able to be there in a way that didn't feel awkward for them, because people can just talk to me. And I also understand enough about the culture of Colombia to be able to connect with his mother and understand, you know, what it is that she's thinking about, ways to manage myself and not be in the way, but also to be able to just bridge that gap and make pictures. And I think that's what ends up resulting in interesting work for me. You'd asked about the LA Times, and I just have to say, like, working at the LA Times was one of my favorite chapters of my career. And I always am careful to say, like, I never photographed for the Times. That was not part of my photographic career, but it was the beginning of that career. And I loved working with reporters and photographers. They were amazing. I would meet with people one-on-one or in small groups to give language lessons. And, you know, these are people who are out and about in the community. And so, you know, they know amazing restaurants. They know what's happening. And so it was just amazing for me to work with them and talk with them. They were great students. It's a different thing when you're no longer getting graded.
I'm sure.
So it was, you know, it really changes things. And I was a TA in my time as a student at UCI, and I taught Spanish language classes, and I loved teaching those classes. But it really was great to like teach people who didn't feel like, oh, you know, I have to get a grade. It's like they wanted to learn. Yeah. And they had a really practical reason for wanting to learn. But they were also just wonderful. I mean, journalists are really curious people, and they're really sharp. And so to be with those people every day was really a treat for me.
Yeah. Tatum and I, like you mentioned the one photograph, but Tatum and I went through your website and we selected a few photographs. Yeah, a few photographs that we liked, you know, and a few that caught our eye were ones that really hit on this, I guess, this subject of intimacy. And you talked about one of the family, right? And just in general, we wanted to know how do you find a story in the ordinary, like something so simple as people eating at the dinner table?
I think it's something that journalists really taught me to appreciate when I was at the LA Times. You know, in journalism, there's a regular practice of finding feature photos, which is just the wonder of everyday life, the things that we have to observe as photographers in order to see. And I think that that's become such a part of my process, is to try to observe. And something that I've learned in my time as a photographer is that whenever people get together, something will happen. There's so much about our lives, and which is part of the challenge of this current time that we're in, right? With the pandemic, we're challenged to come together. But I think, you know, whenever people come together, whenever a family sits down at a dinner table, for me, it's like, there's going to be a picture here. And whenever people are gathered in a place, there's going to be a picture here. And my job as a photographer is to think about where that might come about, where do I want to be, and how do I anticipate that. My job as a photographer is to start observing things like, you know, where's the light coming from in this room, and what's the mood, and what's likely to happen, and to kind of be ready for that to unfold. And that's a lot of my process, is to try to find that. And it's my favorite part of the process. My favorite thing about my work is that, you know, I'll go meet perfect strangers who I will talk with, and somehow they will invite me into their home, and I will be able to spend time with them and get to know them. And hopefully by the end of it, whether it's an hour or 6 hours, we all feel like we've gotten to know each other, and we're better people for it.
Yeah, that kind of plays back into the idea of being just a student of the world and being able to communicate with people. And you photograph those simple moments, but you also photograph the more difficult moments of life, namely your work at refugee camps. it's very easy, as we know, especially now in the age of the internet, to photograph sensationalized moments that, make, the front cover story. But as we've seen in your work, you are consistent in your dedication to photographing moments that are more subtle and less, I guess,
Maybe less flashy.
less flashy. Yeah. So what's your philosophy behind that, and how do you find those moments?
And also, one of the other things that I wanted to ask was, do you ever find it difficult, especially in those difficult situations, to be a fly on the wall, to be like standing and like sort of bearing witness to these difficult events, but not interfering?
Right.
Yeah, I think those are all amazing questions.
We're just like, bam, sorry.
No, I love it. Because you really make me think about like, what is it that I'm trying to do? And I think as a photographer, that's a question I have to ask myself every day is like, what am I trying to do here? What is it that I'm here for? I think one of the things that I'm often thinking a lot about is like, in our culture right now, this sort of Instagram, TMZ, the sensational is almost overcovered.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much that happens before and after or on the margins of those sensational moments. There's so many things that continue even after that early moment has unfolded. And so I think my job as a photographer often is to maybe try to think beyond that sensational moment. So the fact that, refugees have been in the Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya since the early 2000s, since the late 90s even, it's like people have grown up already in that camp. People have had, whole lives. And so like the initial story about what sent people to that camp or the fact that the camp came to exist is long faded. But the life in the camp continues. And so there is something to find there. I think that for me, particularly when I travel, it's like, I'm well aware that most of the time photographers are turning their lenses onto people who are on the economic margin of a place that's already on the economic margin. And people who often don't have any defense or very little capacity to advocate for themselves. And so once I factor that into my thinking, I then become responsible for what is it that is something significant about this person. And so often it's not the fact that they were displaced from their home. That's a fact. It's not a fact. It's not necessarily the fact that their country was subject to a war or some sort of natural disaster. I mean, that's a fact, but that's not who they are. And so part of my job is to try to think if I can see something that can tell us who someone is. Because what I want people to understand is not that this person is a refugee, because that's not an essential fact about them as a human being. What I need people to see is that this is a human being. And if you can understand something about this human being, you might understand something about yourself. Mm-hmm. If I'm going to photograph someone in Africa who is Black, then is there something that I hope you can tune into as you start to understand the condition of Blackness in the Americas? Whether that's in Central America, the Caribbean, or whether that's on the coast of Florida and the Delta. Because there are commonalities among all of us on that diaspora, and for lots of the same reasons. And so I'm really trying to sort of knit together our sense of humanity. And what I really want to do is sort of stop, to the extent that I can, using this sort of Western gaze or this North American gaze. I'm trying to reduce that on some level, because that's what happens is we look at something sensational that happens halfway around the world, and we pat ourselves on the back for how orderly we are. And what I'm hoping is instead, like, we'll recognize a shared humanity.
And, with that in mind, as photography acting as a sort of connecting agents for people all across the world, why is photography? Is that why photography is such a powerful tool? How can it hurt and help situations?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, because I think what you're getting at is sort of, there are limits to what photography can do, right?
Yes.
So I think that what photography can do is it can open up our imagination. And so, when I went to the Philippines, one of the things that was really important to me is to think a little bit about what do Americans imagine about the Philippines. Americans have pretty limited imaginations about the Philippines. Philippines was our colonial possession for 50 years, and we think about things like military bases. We think about things like Apocalypse Now was filmed there. But we don't think about the Philippines as a place where there's a thriving urban life. We don't think about the Philippines as part of cultural production in the world. And so when I went to the Philippines, it's like I have to start understanding the Philippines in ways that are counter to our imagination. And so, some of that is my research, and some of that is me just really trying to get out and see anything I can see and talk to people and try to treat them as our cultural equals. And trying to find things that don't represent the sort of typical view that we have. And so in the way that photography can stereotype, photography can also defy stereotypes depending on what we decide to do with it. And so when you get to the danger, I think part of the danger is what doesn't get photographed and who doesn't get to photograph. And so if the same people are reproduced as people who photograph, and if our cultural attention is a reproduction of the typical gaze of photography, going back to these, scientific portraits of slaves and people in thatched huts, if that's the legacy of reproduction that is happening, then we're not really thinking about and imagining the world in a way that allows for us to widen our view and understand the world differently. So it's almost like two sides of the same coin, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think that has a lot to do, like you were said, in America, we have a very, limited gaze, and I think that we tend to go towards more archetypal ideas of places rather than, being like a fly on the wall, like Sydney said, in those places, so that we broaden our scope of what, the world really looks like. So I think your work is very important. And flash forwarding to your role as the chief of photography at Tufts University, we wanted to know what your role looks like, what your daily routine looks like in that position, and also what are some of your favorite subjects to photograph in your role?
Yeah, and how might you carry on like that theme that we were just talking about, about connecting humanity as an instructor?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I mean, I think it's sort of interesting. When I started photographing with an interest in all these things that we've been talking about. And then there's like part of my job, which is like, I'm a photographer for a university. and in some ways, it's like the thing that I love the most is that no 2 days are alike. Yeah. It's like some days I will spend a lot of the day photographing. And other days it's like I'm going to be sitting in front of my screen in a meeting or on email or toning files and captioning files. Like I said, no 2 days are alike. But I think that my goal as a university photographer is not that dissimilar from my overall goal with photography. It really is to make life at this institution that I serve real and to bridge that gap. And doing so serves a lot of purposes, right? Like every university has to raise funds. If we want universities to be places that are inclusive, we have to have financial aid dollars so that we can include people. And so part of my endeavor is to make compelling pictures that are real people and that bridge that gap. Part of my job at the institution is to think about who we haven't talked about or photographed so that we widen our imagination of who is a student at this institution. And that's fundamentally important. And then with that, I have to be really mindful of how we think about students. And so this particularly becomes important when we talk about students of color. We can fall into very stereotypical portrayals of students. Are we only showing Black students as athletes? Have we neglected to show Black students as scientists? That's part of the thing that I have to think about. When we start talking about Latino students, it's like family is incredibly important to Latino culture. And so when I go to Mateo's home, part of the thing that I'm paying real close attention to is like, who is his family? And what does it mean for him to sit down for a final meal with his mother before he gets up and gets on a bus? And part of the meaning of that whole set of pictures later becomes when he walks into his dorm room all alone and sets that bag down on the bed. That's part of the meaning of that picture, is like, he's left his family, which is huge for him. And it's not huge for all of our students. You know, some of our students, it's the natural expectation. You're going to turn 18, you're going to go to college. We're going to drop you off at college and have a great time. And so part of the thing that I'm trying to help us all do is sort of understand that there are different experiences of being a student, and that's valuable to us as an institution. You know, I really, it's really fundamentally important to me as a first generation to college student that we really think about what that experience is about and who inhabits that experience, and try to do that in a way that's compelling and complex.
With COVID, with the presence of COVID, do you think that your subject matter will have shifted in the future?
That's a great question. I think like everything in our lives, the pandemic has really shifted all of my work. So a lot of my work has been being close to people, going into their homes. And obviously, I'm not doing that these days. Yeah, it's like, okay. And at the same time, like, I think there is a connection to forge. I think that the remarkable thing about the pandemic is, you know, people have been so open to my presence in ways that I haven't felt in years. And I think part of it is because we've all been isolated. And I think that there is something about being seen, and there's something about me trying to connect, because every time I make a picture, I'm trying to connect, even if I have to be 6 feet away. And so I think that that's been a fantastic part of this experience of working through this pandemic. The other thing that's really remarkable is all of our spaces and processes have been transformed. And, you know, I've worked on my campus now for 15 years. And so all of a sudden, the lobby in the library is remarkable again. You know, the statue that sits in the corner has a mask on it because somebody decided to do something funny, and now it's remarkable again. So it's given me all new reasons to photograph things that I didn't have to think about for years, and it's made everything fresh. And I think that for me has been really vital, like to try to turn what has been left behind into something that now has been transformed, and now we all have a reason to think about it again. And that's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, it goes back to appreciating those simple moments.
Yeah.
I think that's what I think that's, you know, all you can really do in this moment. So you being able to find those simple, subtle moments, like even a statue having a mask on, is like incredibly important and very telling to the time, because there's a story in that. And we wanted to know, our last question is, what is your hope for your career and just the field of photography in the future, knowing everything that we know now about the present moment and the changes that are happening?
Yeah. So on the question of my career, I would say I want to teach more. I love teaching. I've loved teaching since I was teaching at UCI as a TA. I do some teaching now, but I don't do nearly enough. And I really want to move into that space of really teaching a lot more. I just love that dialogue, and I love inhabiting the world of ideas with students. I love what students come up with, and like, you all are amazing as students. And I hope you understand that, like, for people teaching you, it's really important that you succeed. It's really important that you grow as individuals. Like, that's part of the joy of teaching. And so I get a lot of gratification from that. And so I want to do that more. I also want to do more personal work. Like, as much as I have enjoyed and loved the institutional work that I've done, and I've made it as meaningful as I can, and will continue to do that. But I think I want to keep working. I want to get back to Latin America, for example. I want to get back out to areas of places where I came from. And so some of the work that I'm beginning to research now is like going back to my mother's neighborhood in Louisville, Kentucky, which was a neighborhood that was established after emancipation. And I've sort of begun to dig up some of the oldest maps of that neighborhood back to 1867. Oh. And I'm trying to begin to think about what it meant to construct that space and what's still left, and sort of how do we make meaning of what that space has been and is becoming now. Because it's very important to my family, but also who I am. Like I am who I am in part because of the legacy of that history and that community that lived there. So I want to preserve some of that, but I also want to explore it as a set of ideas about contemporary American life. Photography remains a really powerful tool. And if you think about it, like everything we're doing, like Instagram is this incredible platform. It's all photography. There is some video. Apple, Google, all of these brands, they're all using photography. Like photography is incredibly important to our culture, maybe more important than ever. And we're really saturated with it. But I think what I'm hoping is that this present moment between the pandemic, but also the political and social changes that we're seeing, I hope it re-engages us in a dialogue about what's important. Mm-hmm. I think that photography can help reconnect us with that. We can use photography to distract us. That's what a lot of consumption on social media is about. But I think we can also use photography to inform our culture, which I think we're starting to see some of as well. Like some of the things that I've been hearing about my hometown with the protests around Breonna Taylor have not come from media, but have come from people making images and making videos there. And they're using these same tools that are normally used to advertise to help us have a dialogue about what's happening in that culture, in that space. And so that is really exciting to me, is that, photography can continue to be that.
Thank you so much, Alonso, for coming on to the show. And I really, really enjoyed listening to you, listening to your passions. And has anyone told you that you have like a great laugh? Like your laugh is great. It's really, really great.
Thank you.
It's great.
Thank you. It was my pleasure to be here today. I mentioned it to you, Sydney, the other night, but my niece is a UCI student.
Right, yeah.
Callie Nichols. She's a second-year student, and she loves Joshua Tree. So if she heard that you all went to Joshua Tree, she'd be like, I want to go back to Joshua Tree. But she's back in Kentucky doing her classes remotely. But, it's just been such a pleasure. Like when you all emailed me, I thought about her, and I was like, yes, I want to talk to these folks. I'm really honored that you would have me on your show. And I just love it. And I love UCI. Like I really miss UCI. And I'm glad you all are enjoying it. That's right. That's right. Yes. That's it.
Wow, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Yes, it really has been.
Yeah, stay in touch with me. Let me know how you're doing. If there are questions you have, if there's something I can help you out with, please drop me a line.
Thank you guys for joining us for another episode of The Welcome Table. This has been Sydney
and Tatum.
And we'll see you guys next time.
Bye.
Bye.